right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. So it's a question and answer based podcast. If you have a question that you would like me to answer or talk about or get an expert in to talk about it, go over to fearcastpodcast.com. You can click on the submit a question link, send me the question there. You can also send me your audio question. You can email your audio question, record it into your phone, send it to me, send it to questions@fearcastpodcast.com. You can go over to Instagram, send me a DM, record your audio there by clicking on the little microphone button in the text box, and just record your audio there. You can also just record it and upload it to Google Drive and send me the shared drive link, and I'll get it that way. So audios go to the tippity top of the list, as what is happening today with Linda's question. So before I get into Linda's question, I just wanted to again thank everybody for letting me into your ears and letting me be a part of your recovery. I don't take it lightly. This has been a fun adventure for me to do. In the time that I've been doing this, it seems now everybody has a podcast. You guys probably have a podcast right now that you're recording. So they're everywhere, and I just am so appreciative that I've been able to do this for all this time. And again, I've said it before, I'm going to do this until I stop getting questions or until I die. And I might still answer a couple of questions even after that. We'll see how it goes. But I really have nothing else to say at the top of the list or top of the podcast today. There's, I guess the only thing to say is, America, we're going into election season. Let's all not collectively lose our ever-loving mind. And if your horse doesn't win, whoever your horse is, let's not burn America down because of that, and be civil and encourage one another. And we'll get through another 4 years of whoever it is, and we'll see where it goes. That's the point of it, right? Of just trying to make this the best thing that we can and not burn it down. So let's not be the worst type of people. I don't know if everybody's out there dealing with the stress of the election, or if you're internationally and stressed with our ridiculousness. I can't even imagine what it's like for people around the world to be watching America in our chaotic nightmare. And people around the world listen. I get calls from people in other countries, and it's awesome. It's awesome. I love getting questions from outside of America and inside of America too. Anyways, you've heard me ramble. I'm just going to shake it off, and we're just going to get onto the question. So here is Linda's question.
Hi, Kevin. I hope you're doing okay. First of all, I would like to say that English is not my first language. So yeah, if I make some mistake, that's why. But anyways, I was diagnosed with OCD in 2017 and been taking medication for it, and it has helped me like a lot. I was in a very dark place, to be honest, because I didn't know what was like quote unquote wrong with me. So I started to feel really like depressed, really down. So I went to see a psychiatrist, and he was like, "Oh, you have OCD." I was like, "Yeah." I thought so. Anyways, and I've been doing therapy for the last 2 years, and it's been really helpful too. But in the last couple of months, I've been facing some hardships with harm OCD and some other thoughts like sexual orientation OCD that lead to harm OCD. And it's been really weird, really complicated, because I've been doing some techniques, like some CBT techniques, like exposing myself to the triggers and etc. And I've recently started to see a therapist that is specialized in CBT. So she's been like helping me to create a program, right, that will help my needs more, like will deal with my specific fears and compulsions specifically. Anyways, my question, I wouldn't say it's a question, but it's more like, I don't know, a thought. It's what I find most difficult, like more difficult than to deal with the thought when it comes to my mind, is that when I try to expose myself intentionally to the fear, it doesn't feel as urgent as when the thought just pops into my mind like randomly, So I'm just like at work doing something, and a harm thought just comes to my mind. What if I grab this knife and stab someone? And it's overwhelming. It's crazy. It's like, whoa, what is going on? But when I try to do that intentionally, it feels like it's not for real. It's kind of like, oh, now you're not actually thinking about it. You're forcing yourself to think about it. So when you were thinking about it, automatically it felt more real. So I don't know. I kind of feel like this feeling is more like it's not like real. It's not having the same effect as if I was like doing the technique while the automatic thought was in my head, So anyways, I wanted to hear a little bit about this, and yay, I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.
All right, Linda, thank you for that question. It's so funny the way the questions go in the when I get them in. Sometimes there are themes that I'm not putting together. I'm not asking for them. It just kind of happened. I think this was interesting that this question is sexual orientation OCD leading into harm OCD, whereas I think last week we were talking about relationship OCD leading into harm OCD types of obsessions. So I think it's interesting. So I have nothing else to say about that, but Linda, so let's get into this as best we can. So I think the core of your question, if I understood correctly, is what can I do about this? So let's talk about that. So this pattern that you talk about is something that I notice in therapy, that I've had my colleagues talk about as well, where it's kind of this process where when you're just out there living life and you have what's called a natural exposure, meaning life just kind of gives you exposures. We've talked about this before where, you don't need to intentionally seek out triggers to your anxiety. Don't you worry. Life will do it for you. It's going to show you something. You're going to see something. You're going to hear something. You're going to be watching TV. You're going to hear this song. Your friends are going to mention this. You're going to be just driving down the road and see a billboard that's going to have something on it. And it's not stuff you asked for or sought out intentionally. It just happened. So life will do that to you. And it seems that for some folks, those tend to be of greater trigger. Those are harder to deal with, or this feel more intense than when you intentionally seek them out. Now, this is not everybody's experience. This is some people's experience. So, for some folks, it doesn't really matter. It is anxiety, and you feel it because you feel it. It's all the same and it all sucks. But for some, the natural exposures can feel more intense and difficult. So, Linda, you're not crazy. For anybody else out there who experiences this as well, you're not crazy or more broken, because when you intentionally seek out the exposure, it doesn't trigger you. That's okay. It's just you. It's just how your brain and body tend to work. So it doesn't mean that exposure and response prevention will work for you. It doesn't mean it's a bad approach for you. It just means that there are some different things to incorporate into that or to consider as you're working with this obsession. So I've already kind of alluded to it. So there's kind of these two different types of exposures. There are these natural exposures. Actually, there are three types that I'll address here. There are natural exposures. You just live in life, stuff shows up. And another natural exposure is just your thoughts. just pop in thoughts, feelings, etc. Mental images, you get the idea. Intentional exposures or active exposures are the one where, as you guessed it, you intentionally and actively go seek it out. You didn't need to go look at a picture of a clown, but you went to the Google box, you typed in clown, and it popped up, and you sought that out, right? You can imagine any other situation. So there's another option here called passive exposure. This is more along the lines of, I may have alluded to this in the past. It's where you would do something. Actually, I'm going to mention even a fourth one. So traditionally, or very often, this is the way I've kind of seen it as kind of passive exposures. It's where you kind of create an environment in which the exposure is just kind of there, but it's kind of in the background. Right, so sometimes that's going to be you take your script, your imaginal exposure, your cognitive exposure, and you record that into your phone or wherever, and then you put one earbud in, and you go to the store, or you go to the mall, or you go and hang out with your kids, and you have the exposure just kind of playing in the background. You're cleaning the house, and that exposure is just kind of playing in your head over and over for like an hour, 2 hours. You check in, you check out. Sometimes you're triggered, sometimes you're not, but you just kind of have it. Another similar one is what I call an environmental exposure. It's where you create the environment in which you're constantly exposed to that trigger. And that might mean putting words up all over the house, putting the background on your computer, the background on your phone, the home screen on your phone as well as a trigger. So similarly, you can put you can write it on the back of your hand if you want to, whatever your triggering word is. And these are just different ways that you're living your life, but everywhere around you is going to be a trigger of some type. Now, is this all exposure and response prevention? Yes, but notice the second part to that. Response prevention. We've talked about before that the ERP, exposure and response prevention, is broken up into two parts: exposure and response prevention. The RP part to that is the most important part. If you are doing exposures or experiencing exposures and given to responses, meaning compulsions, every single time, it doesn't matter. I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It undermines your success, and it significantly limits the effectiveness of the exposure. I'm not going to say it's not going to help, but it's not going to help as much, right? It's kind of like, it's great to go to the gym and work out and run and lift things and do yoga and all that stuff, and that's going to be really healthy for you. But if you immediately go to McDonald's and you just gorge yourself on fast food immediately afterwards, I mean, it may not completely undermine the work you just did at the gym, but it's certainly not going to help, and it's not going to help you get towards your goals. So, response prevention is necessary in the process. So, that brings me, to a certain degree, to what we were talking about here, Linda. So, actually, the first thing I want to mention here is you were mentioning in 2017, you just been diagnosed, your started medication is helping, all that stuff. And you said you were in a really dark place. And you said that, you didn't know what was wrong with you, led to depression. This is a really common experience for people with OCD. And I'll broaden that to anxiety, and we can incorporate like phobias or social anxiety or generalized anxiety, that sort of stuff. It's on the anxiety spectrum. That's why we call them anxiety spectrum disorders. And OCD is one of the parts of that spectrum. Anyways, I've heard it said it is incredibly depressing to have anxiety and incredibly anxiety-provoking to have depression. They are going to be linked. And for the most part, I, to a certain degree, expect that if I meet someone who has OCD, I expect that there's going to be a certain level of depression for a couple of reasons. One, it can be incredibly depressing to feel like you have to do things that you don't really want to do or you don't feel is important. Or it's going to be depressing to not do things that you really want to do, both of which are related to those compulsions or the feeling like you have to or you can't. Right? We've talked about it as the golden cage of compulsion, where, yes, you feel safe in the world of compulsion, but it's a small world. It's a little cage that you're in. Yes, it's nice because it's a golden cage, but it's still a cage, and you're still in jail for it, from it, with it, because of it. Anyways, so those two things are going to go hand in hand. I also wonder if, for some folks, and for you perhaps, Linda, that level of depression is also related to a certain level of shame involved with the nature of the thoughts that you're having. So sexual orientation OCD and harm OCD, both of these can, to a certain degree, fall in the taboo subjects kind of realm. And there can be a lot of shame for having kind of sexually related obsessions, and there can be some shame involved with having harm-related obsessions, especially if it's harm towards other people, harm towards yourself. One can feel as if you're bad, or you're broken, or you're sinful, or you're what word am I trying to think of? You're sinister, or I can't think of the word right now. But anyways, somehow less than, because of the nature of the obsession. So you kind of tell yourself that I'm terrible, I'm awful, I'm horrible because of this. One of the things that we're trying to do, and Kimberly Quinlan's podcast does a ton on this. She has a book on this. There's a lot of stuff out there for it, or a growing amount, I should say, on incorporating compassion. I maintain that you cannot appropriately treat OCD and anxiety disorders without addressing the shame involved with the obsessions. You have to be able to say, these obsessions are there, they are part of me, they aren't the entirety of me, and I am still a good and worthwhile and lovable, and I am qualified to live this life, right? So we're not othering ourselves because of these thoughts. We're saying, I am still good and worthwhile, and I have these thoughts. Not, I'll be good once those thoughts are gone. I'll be okay once this OCD is not there. It is, and I have these thoughts, and I have these feelings, and I can live my life. All right. So that's its whole separate conversation. But what I wanted to get at for you is that you were talking about you were doing some exposures. So I hope you were doing response prevention to that. You didn't specifically mention that, but I know when people talk about exposures, they sometimes incorporate response prevention. But I want you to be intentional about noting what compulsions you may be doing when you are doing exposures or when you are exposed. So so let's go to the basis of your question. What can you do about this reality that when you try to do exposures, intentional, active exposures, the anxiety is not as high? Well, one of the main things that I'll recommend for this is still intentionally practicing ERP. So whatever that looks like for you. So you didn't give a ton of detail as to which tends to be the greater obsession. You talked about sexual orientation OCD tends to lead into harm OCD. So scripting can certainly help. Exposing yourself, being intentional about exposing yourself to people of the people that tend to trigger you. So you weren't clear about whether or not you are triggered by men or women or a combination or however it was going to work. So intentionally exposing yourself, having conversations with people that trigger your anxiety, right? By doing that, you are, and you can probably do this in a passive sort of way. If you're working in an office building or if you're working, wherever you work, odds are there's going to be a mixture of both men and women there. So be intentional about speaking to everybody, especially if there's an avoidance to one. Now, this may be a mixed bag, right? In the sense that it's an active exposure because you're saying, let's say, just for argument's sake, it is women who are activating your anxiety here. So you're going to intentionally speak to women on staff. You're not going to completely ignore men, but you're certainly not going to ignore the women on staff. Go say hi to them, try to get to know them, have conversations with them. Now, you're probably already doing that in the course of living your day. So this is where I don't know which one of those situations is triggering your anxiety more. If you intentionally go talk to Sarah over there, or if it's just in the course of having to talk to Sarah because you got to get your TPS report from her, then that's what it triggers. Either way, I want you to intentionally go around and talk to these people. You get the idea what it's going to do. Here's another thing that you can also do with this is intentionally kind of set traps for yourself for ERP. Now, what I mean by that is you're kind of doing a combination here of doing intentional exposures, but allowing them to be things that are just going to kind of surprise you during the day. Now, I don't know for you, Linda, if this is not going to count because you know you did it, right? But you can perhaps set Post-it notes up. So I love Post-it notes. I post it. If you're out there, I suppose 3M owns them, I think. Let me just say, who owns them? I don't know. Doesn't matter. But apparently they're recyclable, so that's something. Anyways, I have so many on my desk. But Post-its, if you write down all the words that trigger your anxiety, harmosity or otherwise, write them on a Post-it note. Stick them up everywhere. Now, you can do code, right? So for some people, like the word stab might feel uncomfortable, so they might just write S on a paper, and they know what that means. Or they draw a symbol that to them represents stabbing or violence, etc. Post them up. If people have questions about them, you can say, oh, it's just a reminder for a thing I have to do later after work. They don't need to know the details of it. They don't need to know, Rebecca, I have this up here because, well, I'm terrified I'm lesbian and that I might, decapitate you or something like that, right? It's that you put this up to set a trap for yourself and hide them all over the place, right? You can carry a knife with you. Put one in your purse, put one in your pocket, put one somewhere. So then when you're rooting through it to try to get your keys and you happen to grab that knife, that might trigger your anxiety. And good. You knew that anxiety was going to be there. And that's where you practice response prevention. You acknowledge that feeling. You acknowledge the spike of anxiety and you remind yourself, oh, that's right, this feeling's there. And you let yourself ride through that feeling. The more times you come across that knife, the easier it's going to get. Similarly, you can put pictures up. I talked about the passive exposures of or the environmental exposures of putting them up on your phone, on your computer, etc. Be creative with it, right? Now, if you have a friend who you trust, they can set traps for you. So they can take those Post-its and stick them everywhere in your life and not tell you where they are. And you come across them, you didn't know they're going to be there, and bam, exposure. Okay. So all of this ultimately is just getting at continuously putting yourself at risk of exposure. Now, as you're doing this, it is going to be most important, as I've talked about before, to practice response prevention. When you're living your day and the unintentional exposure comes up, what do you do about it? Do you avoid? Do you give yourself reassurance? Do you try to do a sneaky exposure of if you're, again, for the example of women. So if you're looking at women, you quickly look at a man. If you look at a woman, you quickly think about a past relationship with a man, or you think about this archetypical man and how attracted you are. Do you try to enact a physical sensation to elicit a feeling of attraction towards the thought? Or do you try to elicit a feeling of repulsion towards the woman? Right? We're practicing noticing that feeling and observing what that feeling is like. And you can practice then saying, this feeling is here to the degree that it is. I can make space for that. Because you've continually every day, you've been doing exposures, as we just talked about, you're trying to push yourself beyond your limits and trying to make yourself feel uncomfortable. There is an exercise called leaning into fear. I forget exactly where it's from. It's from a mindfulness or acceptance commitment therapy book. But the whole point is the it's a narration that if you Google it, you may be able to find it, though I believe they took the audio down from their website. They had a bunch of tracks listed that you could access. Let me see if I can just do this at the same time. Leaning into Fear book. This is completely useless. None of this is helpful. This is something I should have done in advance. Didn't. Anyways, Google that. It's a mindfulness thing. The gist of it is you envision, you pause yourself and intentionally sit down, close your eyes, and I want you to create this image in your mind of the thing that tries to bring on anxiety. Notice the feelings that come up. Where do you feel it in your body? Does it have a color, a shape, a sound, a vibration, a movement, etc.? And then you try to make it bigger. What do you have to do to make it bigger, to chase it down? Do you have to amplify the vision? Do you have to intentionally get closer to you? Do you have to make it bigger? Do you have to make it smaller? What do you have to do to try to bring that feeling on more and more? And then you sit with that for a certain period of time. And you'll notice that you'll get distracted. It's okay. It's normal. You bring yourself back to it. You'll notice that that feeling gets less intense as you're staying with that image. Your brain is trying to take you to the next stage of it or take you to this other thought, but you ain't having it. You're bringing yourself back to that image, that thought, that trigger, whatever it is. And you notice that it gets less intense over time. Good. And then you lean into it more. What do you have to do to make it worse or harder or more intense or more terrible? And you do that. And you do that a couple of times. And this whole audio, by the way, it's a 20-minute thing, all right? You can do it for 20 minutes. You can do it for 5 minutes. It doesn't matter. But you're intentionally sitting there and trying to lean into it, and you're coaxing it. You're calling its bluff. You're trying to goad it into a fight. You're trying to say, bring it on. You're leaning into your fear. So that when you're living your day and you get that trigger, you'll say, I felt that before and I didn't run from it. And I can get through this and I can ride that spike of anxiety because for whatever reason, my body and brain are spiked by this. And that's okay. I can have anxiety. My silly amygdala can be triggered and that's all right. But I don't need to deal with it through compulsion, through avoidance, through reassurance. I can deal with it by just continuing to talk to Sarah over there, continuing to turn in your TPS reports. And that's okay. So those are some things that you can do. And don't undermine the work that you're doing because it doesn't feel less or doesn't feel as intense as in regular life, right? It still counts. It's still important. Give yourself that encouragement. You can face it. Okay, the feeling shows up and it's more intense, but we're practicing being open to a greater and greater amount of discomfort as it's there, but we're not in regular life linger on it. I want to specify this. We can linger on it through exposure, and there'll be plenty of people who will argue with us on the purpose of lingering on it or exposure, or whether or not we need to do it, or whether just response prevention or whatever. Point is we are intentionally then giving ourselves encouragement because we're making space for just our body's reaction to a feeling. And it can feel intense and it can feel painful. And we're saying that's okay. I can live through this. I can survive this. I can ride through this feeling and it's going to go away. And I'm going to get back to a quote sense of normalcy eventually. Maybe not right now, but eventually. But I don't need to deal with it, and I don't need to make that feeling go away through these compulsive things. It'll just go away on its own because it always does, because it always will. So, because anxiety doesn't care whether or not, it's like the beginning of the month. It's not like, okay, it's like the first of the month, so you get like 1s and 2 anxiety. But like, man, towards the 30th, boy, that's what 8s and 9s and 10s, right? It's not that predictable. We're being open to whatever anxiety happens to be there and increasing our willingness to have it and not shutting ourselves down, not getting mad at ourselves, saying, yep, it's there, and we're going to go with it. So I hope this helps. I hope this answers your question. If listeners out there have other suggestions, I know you therapists are out there too. I know you people listen. I know. Now, if you have other suggestions and recommendations, let me know. I'd love to hear your suggestions and recommendations. I will put them up on a future episode if y'all send them to me, and I will recount how to get in touch with me again. You can go over to fearcastpodcast.com and send me a message yonder. You can go to Instagrams and you can send me a message over there. I am Fearcast Podcast there. So send it in. I would love to hear it if I missed it or if there's a fuller or different way to do it. Now, of course, there are other modalities that we can talk about. We can talk about ICBT. We can talk about just straight up ACT. We could talk about the Greenberg method. We can talk about the master. We can talk about any one of those. And if you have recommendations and suggestions, I'd love to hear it. So, Linda, those were my thoughts on this. I hope this was helpful. Thank you again so much for sending this in, and best of luck in the process. Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously.